Welcome to the Paul Chandler Show, everyone. I'm your host, Paul Chandler. Now, tonight's episode, we're actually going to begin a new series on op reporting as far as the dissection of the op report for how the coder will have to do it. Because recently we had just one episode on op reporting as far as dissecting it, looking at all the different paragraphs and extracting out what coders need, and that was our original plan. But then we had some awesome feedback from that video from Sarah M, and she asked us to do some more. So then we thought we're going to start doing these, but we do one for every organ system. So just by happenstance, the first video we did was on the first organ system in the CPT book, the integumentary system, and that's how we're going to go along. So in tonight's episode of the Paul Chandler Show, we're going to be dissecting a musculoskeletal system op report, coding it from scratch, and you'll be seeing my screen and going along, and I'll be explaining what I'm doing as we look at that op report and extract what we need, so coders in the real world environment, we can know what we need to do when we're coding for orthopedics. So stay tuned and we'll be right back. So we see here that we have in the post-op diagnosis, comminuted left proximal humerus fracture. So we have that in the post-op diagnosis. And we have then the indications. So remember the indications helps the pre-op diagnosis information, kind of lets us know why the patient's there. Then if we have a findings section, that's where we would have additional post-op information. And since we only have a pre-op and a post-op, and then the indications, nowhere do we have the findings. So on the diagnosis side, now we do have the indications. Patient is a 66-year-old female who sustained a severely comminuted proximal humerus fracture. The risk and benefits of the surgery were discussed, blah, blah, blah. So that just really helps reinforce what we have, comminuted left proximal humerus fracture. So this is what I'm going to be looking up in my ICD-10 book. And remember, when we look up information in the front of ICD-10, we start with the most generic word first in the condition, and then get more specific as we drop down. So remembering the who, what, where, why, when, and how. What does the patient have? The patient has a fracture. So out of comminuted left proximal humerus fracture, the word fracture is the most generic word that we have. So I'm looking up the word fracture. And in my AAPC 2018 ICD-10 CM book, fracture takes me starting to right column, basically right in the middle of page 179. Now with fracture, I have, starting then the drop downs, and I have a lot of drop downs. Fracture is also all page 180, page 181, 182, 183, 184, and goes into page 185. So fractures has a little bit more than 5 pages worth of drop downs. So we want to make sure that we're doing the drop downs correctly, hence following the yellow lines that helps us along in the AAPC version of the ICD-10 book. So the other words that I have comminuted, left, proximal, and humerus. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to strike through words that I've already used. Just help me, in this case, to show you the process of elimination. Now, when I'm looking at my ICD-10 book, the drop downs, after we get past the due to part, the drop downs first start with where is the bone. For example, now notice that we do have pathological fracture and traumatic fracture. Pathological fracture starts on middle right part of page 179. And then the bottom left part of 180 starts fracture, comma, traumatic. So traumatic would be with it being in an incident. In this case, how it says the patient sustained, so that lets us know that this is due to an accident.
So looking at traumatic fractures, bottom left part of page 180. Then the drop downs, I need my location. And commuted tells us what type of fracture it is. Left tells us the laterality. And proximal tells us, proximal and distal. Proximal closest to the center of the body, distal farther away, like distance. So humerus tells us where, let me get that word one highlighted. Humerus tells us the location of the fracture. So I'm going to fracture in the traumatic section. Again, that begins in the bottom left part of page 180. And I'm going to humerus as my first drop down, which that would take me about 1.5 inches down on the third column, the right column, on page 181. So the top right part of page 181, there is where my humerus begins. And then my other types of drop downs that I have looking from humerus, I have anatomical neck, articular process. I'm getting other parts here. Nothing's helping me so far. I have lower end. From lower end, I have proximal end, then I have shaft. And there we go. I have proximal end. Okay, so I have the word proximal available. I have proximal end, which is just the same thing as saying proximal. So now I'm going to cross out the word proximal. However, here though, I get rerouted. So when I'm looking up fracture, drop down humerus, drop down proximal end, it says C fracture, humerus, upper end. So here I am, when I see fracture, drop down humerus, drop down proximal end, that's the bottom right part of page 181, approximately about 2 inches from the top. But so I still say in the same section though, fracture, humerus, upper end. So that takes me, when I drop down, I just, same column really, I just go down about 2 inches, right to the bottom right part of page 181. And that says, for fracture, drop down humerus, drop down upper end. So now I'm on page 181, the bottom right part of the page, right? So right column towards the bottom, third line, actually, almost at the full bottom, third line from the bottom. And then I have the code S42.20 checkmark box. So it means I need additional characters. But I'm seeing, because I have the terms commuted and left. So I'm seeing my drop downs if I have any additional drop downs that would help me. So now I'm looking at the top left part of page 182. I'm checking all of the humerus for the upper end, and none of those work for drop downs, not articular head, epiphysis, greater tuberosity, and so forth. So that leaves me with fracture humerus upper end, the S42.20 checkmark box, and I need more characters, so I go back. Now I'm checking the S42.20 and seeing what's going on with that. S42.20, S42.20. Okay, here we go. S42.20. That takes me then to again, AAPC 2018 book, S42.20. I'd be the bottom left part of page 1016. S42.20 tells me I need to have a sixth character because I have the 6 TH in a circle. So I have S42.201, 202, 209. And this is regarding laterality. So in this case, I know it's the left side, right there. So to give me S42.202. And then I have the 7th character with the red circle. So I know I need a 7th character. And I am not going to use an X placeholder because I already got 6 so far. And again, you need a 7th character for the X when the 7 TH is in a blue, but in this case it's a red, so I do not need to have the X because I already have 6 characters. scrolling back to see where my 6 characters are. In that case, that would be back to where S42 begins. Under S42, it shows here the 7 characters that could apply. And here in this case, these 7 characters would apply for all of the codes in the S42 category, since the 7 characters are listed right under S42. So here my 7 characters are A, B, D, G, K, P, S. And because we're doing an actual surgery here, meaning it's active treatment, I know it's initial encounter. And I have it, so it'd be either A or B as my 7th character. Now I only have the word commuted to work with. But I have to know, is it a closed fracture or an open fracture? Now, remember though that we always default to the healthier status of the patient whenever a diagnosis code is going to be essentially like, how to say, like if you ever have to guess. Now, looking at the different words here, we just have commuted left proximal humerus fracture. Nowhere in the diagnosis code tells us that if it's an open or closed fracture. Even though on the operative procedure, even though the procedure performed, we know it's an open procedure, the diagnosis code, in this case the post-op diagnosis, would have to state that it's an open fracture as well. Remember with the fractures, if it's a closed treatment, you're going to have a closed fracture. The skin's going to be closed when the patient comes in, and then the doctor's going to keep the patient closed for the skin. Or if it's a closed fracture, you can have an open treatment. In that case, the fracture is underneath the skin is still closed when the doctor starts the procedure, but then decides to manually cut open the patients through the skin to be able to visually see the fracture. So a closed fracture can either be a closed treatment or an open treatment. But if the patient comes in with an open fracture, we're going to have an open treatment. If the patient comes in with an open fracture, they're going to go and keep the skin open. They're not going to close the skin and then start treating the patient. If that ever happens to you, get a good lawyer and get a new doctor. So here, we're going to assume that this is a closed fracture because there's no documentation showing that in the post-op diagnosis that it was open already. So that would give us the 7th character A. So I'm going to put this up here next to the post-op diagnosis. So we would have, in this case, S42 .202A as the diagnosis code. And the diagnosis code, I'm going to actually highlight that like in a green color to make it different than the yellow highlights. So there's a diagnosis code, S42.202A. Now I can look at the op report and see what we're doing procedure-wise. Procedure, we have an open treatment of left proximal humerus. So in this case, I'm looking up in the back of the CPT book. Remember that normally we can look up in the back of the CPT book based on either the type of procedure the patient's doing or the location. Remember, the fracture is a little bit different. That whenever we're doing treatment on a fracture, the first word we actually look up is the word fracture. So this is one of the rare few instances where we have to look up the word fracture, the condition the patient has, in the back of CPT. So fracture, 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 fracture. Fracture takes me to page 896, right column, and almost about halfway down. And all of page 897, and about 5/6 of page 898. So with the fractures, I drop down, and I see that the different types of the first drop down I have is where the fracture's at. So we have an open treatment of left proximal humerus. So then looking at the codes, sorry, that was my alarm there. So looking at the codes, we have for fracture, then we have to go to drop down to humerus, and humerus would take me to page 897, middle column towards the top. So I'm going to use the humerus. So that word we've already used. And then I drop down. I have close treatment, condyle, epicondyle, greater tubicity fracture, open treatment, shaft, supracondyle, transcondylar, and with dislocation or with shoulder dislocation. So the thing that works there is the phrase open treatment. As far as the drop downs, so I can pull that out and do the open treatment drop down. That'll give me the codes 23615 or 23616 as my options. So I look up those codes in CPT. 23615, 23616, 23615, 23. Okay, that takes me to page 136. So page 136, I have codes 23615 and 23616. Open treatment of proximal humeral. So actually right there I can pull out the proximal. That helps. Open treatment of proximal humeral, surgical or anatomical neck fracture, includes internal fixation when performed, includes repair of tuberosities when performed. Okay, that's 23615. Or I have 23616 with proximal humeral prosthetic replacement. And there we go. I like that one because we have humeral head and the debut global fracture stem size. So all of this in the implants tells us that the patient's having a prosthetic replacement put in. Because implant is another way of saying prosthetic. So that leaves me with the 23616 CPT code. And in this case, I would be placing modifier LT for the left because this is done. Let me change this color to green here. Because the operative procedure tells me it's on the left right there. So that would make the CPT code 23616 modifier LT and the diagnosis code S as in Sam 42.202A. And remember that no matter if it's like multiple choice for an exam or coding at real world, that in this case we have modifier LT for the left side, that your diagnosis code has to match the left side as well there. If not, then you're going to have a procedure performed on the left side, but the diagnosis code is on the right side or vice versa. And again, if that ever happens to you, get a good lawyer and get a good doctor because your doctor does not know the difference between right and left.
Thank you for taking your time out and watching how we dissected that musculoskeletal system op report. Now, I said this topic was suggested based on a previous viewer. Again, thank you, Sarah M. If you have any future suggestions for anyone on a topic that you'd like to see on the Paul Chandler Show, just visit thepaulchandlershow.com, and on the top of our webpage, we have a little button that you can click to suggest a topic. Again, so thank you for your time watching this episode, and have an awesome rest of your day.